Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the editorial director of PR Week, Steve Barrett.
Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Not bad, not bad. We're going to get the energy up during the day. Got a fantastic day of content ahead. Those of you who were with us yesterday, welcome back, and I hope you had a good night. Those of you joining us this morning, welcome to PRDecoded. I'm Steve, as the man with the mic just said, editorial director of PR Week. I'm going to host today, along with the other members of the PR Week team, and we're going to dig into a lot of topics today, including brand purpose, but also culture, DE&I, the Hispanic market opportunity, ESG, disability, the CCO and the comms function. That's going to be a big theme today. We've got some fantastic CCOs to hear from, what the CCO's place is in the C-suite, and the challenges in stepping up to deliver on the extra responsibilities being placed on that function, which is good for the profession, but it does bring challenges with it as well as opportunities. So we're going to dig into those. Do stick around for the last panel of the day, because it's a really good one. We've got some of the top in-house PR pros in the country, from Starbucks, from Land O'Lakes, from Mars. We've got Josh Earnest, a former White House press secretary, who's now at United Airlines. So do stick around for that one. We're also going to hear from another lineup of great speakers, including the former Burger King and Activision Blizzard CMO, Fernando Mercado, this afternoon, and many others. So it's a great day of content. Stick with us through the whole day. Now, before we start, a few housekeeping notes. Apologies if we went through this yesterday, but some of you are here for the first time. To connect to the Wi-Fi, it's Convene, the network name. The password is Stay Connected. And stay connected with us on social as well. Get this trending on whichever platform you use these days of your choice. The hashtag is PRDecoded. We encourage you to post and interact as much as possible. Let us know what you're thinking about the sessions. Bring the wider PR community into it. Big thank you to our sponsors before we start today. We couldn't do this without them, and we really appreciate your support. So let's say a big thank you to all the sponsors for helping us put on a great show. You can download the PRDecoded mobile app as well if you haven't already, and you've got a digital program there. We didn't want to hurt the environment, so we've got a digital program. The QR codes to download those assets are on the back of your badge. And we're using Slido for questions, so that's going to come. Oh, and thank you to our charity partner, Gen Youth, which we've worked with for 5 or 6 years. We did a presentation to another school in Chicago yesterday of a breakfast cart, and great partner to work with, and it's our way of putting a little bit back with our conference in Chicago. Download the mobile app. Have we done that one? And tune into our PR Week podcast. We've got a special edition this week with highlights of the event. That'll be live tomorrow morning. And sign up for it if you haven't already, so you get the best of that content each week. I was going to say, we're using Slido, so you can submit questions during the sessions. You can do that anonymously, or you can say who you are, whichever's more comfortable for you. The hashtag will come up on the screen momentarily, I hope. You'll have to go back one, I think. All right. Now, before we start, we've got a quick message from our event sponsor, 3BL. So play video, please. Thank you, 3BL, for your support. We appreciate it. Now, really excited about this first session. It's called Voice of Change, and it's an interview with our 2019 PR Week Communicator of the Year, David Hogg, who's the co-founder of gun control campaigning group March for Our Lives. He's now the co-founder of a youth voting and politics initiative called Leaders We Deserve, and he's going to be interviewed by our fantastic reporter, Ewan Larkin from PR Week, who's going to do the interviews. So please welcome them up to the stage for the first session of the day.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for joining us on day 2 in rainy Chicago. We really appreciate it. We have a lot to get into, David, in only 25 minutes, so I'm not going to waste any time. But I did just want to say, before we get started, remember to send in your questions via Slido. It's not every time you get or it's not often you get the chance to ask a question to David Hogg, so please send some in. But without further ado, David, a lot of people here might know you as the co-founder of March for Our Lives and, of course, a former PR Week Communicator of the Year. But they might not be as familiar with Leaders We Deserve. So I wanted to first, can you start by giving us kind of, what's the mission there, and can you kind of break down that initiative for us?
Yeah, so the half elevator pitch I'll give you all is that, also sorry, I didn't bring any Aflac ducks today, I know. There will no be quacking involved in this ceremony, or this event. But, so Leaders We Deserve, our entire mission is basically trying to be like Emily's List for young people, essentially. We're trying to bring a new generation into politics to lead the fight, not just on the outside, but on the inside. We look at the movements of our generation. Over the past 4 years of Trump's presidency, we basically saw a new chapter of a social movement for every year. We saw the women's movement in 2017 with the Women's March. We saw March for Our Lives in 2018 for gun safety. We saw the environmental movement and the rise of Sunrise and the Green New Deal in 2019. And then we also saw the rise of the civil rights movement and racial justice again in 2020. And throughout college, when I was studying a lot of American history, I looked time and time again at these social movements, and I asked myself, why weren't there more people from these movements who came into power? And the answer is because it was largely inaccessible to the most marginalized Americans that were on the forefront of those movements. That's why in the 60s they had to form things like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, because politics was so inaccessible to many people, especially black and brown people in particular. But because of the decades of work by people like John Lewis and Ella Baker and so many others that do not make it in the history books, those barriers to entry are still there, but they aren't nearly as high. And what the mission of Leaders We Deserve is to help bring more people like Maxwell Frost into office. Maxwell came from March for Our Lives. I worked on his campaign. And he ran against 9 other people, including 2 former members of Congress. And he was 24 years old, a young person who was adopted, and he now is the first member of Gen Z in Congress, the first member of March for Our Lives in Congress, and the first Afro-Cuban person in Congress. And he's just 26 years old. So we believe that it's time to bring more young people into office, because we actually look at people like President Biden, who, I know this is hard to believe, started when he was 29 years old. And we see that as a point of why it's important to elect more young people, because they need to gain that experience to be able to actually pass legislation like the gun safety law we saw passed last year, like environmental spending, like the cancellation of student debt. And the reason why we've been able to do that, I think more than anything, is because President Biden has the relationships on the Hill that he's cultivated over decades. By starting out these young people earlier, we can look at people like LBJ as well, who started when they were young. Time and time again, the greatest leaders in our nation's history have one thing in common, typically, which is that they started when they were very young and gained that experience. So that's kind of why we're doing this, and we're not trying to put all of our eggs in one basket where we're waiting for an Obama-like, Messiah-like figure to come and save us, because no single person can, as amazing as Obama was, right? We need our generation to save itself, and this is what we're trying to do. So we don't try to elect 1,000 people. We try to elect, right now for this cycle, between 15 to 30 young people at the state legislative level, which is where we spend most of our efforts, specifically in lean red to purple states, and then really 2 or 3 people to Congress. So that's what we do.
But how do you go about getting younger people into politics? Because I'm relatively fresh out of college, and I remember there was that kind of feeling that it had been a tumultuous few years, and there was kind of a sense already where it's like, well, I'm not going to vote for either candidate, or I'm just going to sit this out. And there was kind of like a lack of hope almost amongst the young people. So how do you kind of get them engaged? What's the best way to go about it?
Well, I think it's giving them something to vote for rather than something to vote against. You know, I'm sure that you can relate to this. The reason why young people have been voting at such a high rate over the past 3 elections, just for some context, starting in 2018, young people started voting 18 to 29, started voting at the highest rates in American history as a generation of any group of young people in modern American history, basically since we became a full democracy following the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. Not only that, young people are voting very clearly in one direction for candidates that support gun safety, and so much so that in 2022, young people voted at such a high rate and so clearly in one direction. In your average congressional election, we effectively canceled out the votes of people over 65. You don't hear the media talking about that a lot of the time, but it's the truth, and people are paying an electoral price for that. And I think why I was really inspired to do this is because it's not just enough to be on the outside of politics. We need to have the right movements on the outside to hold elected officials accountable and make sure that they don't have the choice of doing the right thing, but they're forced to do the right thing, electorally speaking. Because one of my favorite mantras that I've come up with in my work with March for Our Lives is that the only good politician is a scared politician, frankly, right? And I mean electorally, obviously in a nonviolent way, but it's the truth. They can say that they're with us all they want. For a long time, Democrats said that they were for gun safety, but even when they had a supermajority, following the election of Obama, there was no gun safety passed, despite the fact that they could have gotten through the filibuster. And it was only after we started calling them out and calling out people who stand against us and stand with the NRA that we were able to get things passed. And what we're trying to do here is bring hope to our generation, because I think many people consider Donald Trump a significant threat to American democracy, and I agree with that. But I think there is an equally large but longer-term threat to democracy, which is the fact that we are raising a generation of children that are learning about democracy in their civics classes where they could be killed at any moment in those very civics classes. If you raise a generation of children saying that democracy is the best form of government, but that form of government can't do the bare minimum of keeping kids safe in their schools and people safe in their communities, people are going to lose faith in democracy. What I see this as is giving young people hope, so that even in states like Tennessee, where they're passing horrifying discriminatory legislation against trans people, against LGBT people, they can look at somebody like Justin Jones and see that there is that hope out there, that not only are they reflected demographically, but also ideologically in office, and that not all hope is lost because there are people there like that fighting, with a long-term understanding that this is not going to be solved in one election. This is going to take a generation to help correct this and bring our country back to the place where we all agree that democracy is the best form of government, that we don't plot violent insurrections when one side doesn't win, and that we actually work together as Americans for a better and brighter future where we all agree that, we'll never agree on everything completely, but that's not how we've ever made progress, is focusing by what we can agree on. It's by focusing on what we can and moving forward on that in the first place. And if, as a nation, we were able to land a man on the damn moon, I'm pretty sure that we can stop kids from getting shot in their schools. But unfortunately, we've been let down by a lot of people in power right now. And I think what it's going to require, similar to what happened in the Cold War, we had a generation of young people, Joe Biden's generation, that grew up going through nuclear bomb drills in their schools. That generation went on to pass some of the largest arms reduction treaties in human history. I think it's going to take bringing our generation that has gone through school shooter drills into office, that understands, not in even a partisan way, but a bipartisan way, how unacceptable it is that we're letting our students and our children be on the front lines of this war that is happening in our classrooms by our severely underregulated militia. And I say this too as somebody, by the way, who shoots guns. I was part of the shooting club in college. I've been shooting guns since I was in fourth grade. My dad was an FBI agent. I grew up around these. I understand the power behind these weapons, but I also understand that with that power and with those rights come responsibility. And what we have right now is not gun responsibility in the United States. We have gun irresponsibility because we're failing to ensure the collective responsibility of our society to ensure that guns do not get into the wrong hands. That somebody like the shooter at my high school, a 19-year-old, that threatened to shoot at my high school multiple times, had the FBI and police called on him several dozen times, is not able to legally obtain an AR-15 and continue to own that gun when he is a known threat, that has made those threats, made racist comments, and actively been known to be a danger to the community. So That's why we're trying to bring these young people into office, because we need people in office who understand the anxiety of what it's like to go through a school shooter drill and what it's like to walk over blood-stained sidewalks in their communities on the south and west side of Chicago, for example, where the media does not pay nearly enough attention. And I've worked with those communities. Like just last night, I was with the board chair of March for Our Lives, who's named Trevon, and he's from the south side of Chicago. And he's been working against this gun violence for decades. But his community has never gotten the attention that it deserves in comparison to what Parkland got. And it's not to say that Parkland shouldn't have got the attention that we got. We absolutely should have. We should have gotten the resources that we got. It's to say that every community, no matter what color that community is or how much money that community has, should get the same response from the media, from the state government, the local government, and the federal government. Because if Parkland is safe, but the south or west side of Chicago is not safe, nowhere is safe until we end gun violence everywhere.
Wow. Thanks for that, David. I think I want to switch gears here for a second because we're sitting in a room full of business leaders. I wanted to get your impressions on how do you view brands and companies kind of weighing in on these social issues and events. This is something that's obviously accelerated over the past few years, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic and and after the murder of George Floyd. What's your kind of thoughts on brands taking these social stances? Because there does seem to be some conflating data sometimes. You know, there are firms out there that will tell you they should be weighing in on everything, and then you talk to some of these CCOs and they say that's just not quite the case. So I'm curious to get your impressions and see what you make of that.
Well, for one, if any of you, before I do this, if any of you are interested in my advice personally, I would love to help you out in any way if you'd be willing to help support March for Our Lives, donation-wise, because we need more funding for sure. But you know, I kind of have a hot take here in some ways, and I think that I studied history over the past 4 years in college, and I studied a lot of 20th century American history. And when I look at the most monumental pieces of legislation that were passed, like the Clean Water and Air Acts, for example, I think those are good pieces of legislation, right? That raise the bar across everywhere to make sure that all companies had to play by the same rules, right? And when I think back to that time, and I know that this is probably not going to be a very popular take, I don't think it would have mattered how many progressive CEOs we had. I don't think it would have ever had the same effect as just creating that law and saying it doesn't matter how good of a person you are, or how good of a company you want to be. Regardless, you all are going to have to play by the same rules here and make sure that you're not polluting our waterways so that rivers are not literally catching on fire. That's a reference from decades ago that many of you probably don't remember in this room. But I think that we need to make sure that when companies are pushing for this, it's not through a boom and bust cycle of whenever the public all of a sudden cares about racial justice, the company cares about racial justice. Because I will tell you right now, the short-term investment that your company is making in saying when all of a sudden racial justice is the hot new topic basically that everybody is talking about in 2020, and you make a commitment of several $1 million or something along those lines to helping promote racial justice, but you don't follow through, you're actually hurting yourself in the long term, not only with just older populations that spend more money, but especially the younger generation who is already extremely suspicious of any organization or entity in the first place. And what I would say is if you make a commitment to the CMOs in this room, do not make a commitment unless that money is already on the way, essentially. If you're going to be spending that money to help promote racial justice, don't say you're going to do something and then not do it, because you're going to hurt the trust with our generation. And we're going to lose even more faith in companies doing the right thing because we're going to feel like we're just being betrayed, because we are, over and over again. And then also I would say that there is some need for us and industry advocates, for businesses and social advocates in some ways to come together and say, actually, you know, as much as we want to promote sustainable practices, you know, and our company cares about that, and we want our customers to know that we care about, for example, if we're producing, you know, different materials that require less water, whether it's for pizzas like we heard about yesterday, or whether it's for, you know, textiles. Those companies and those advocates need to come together to make sure everybody has to play by the same rules. And I think that it wouldn't be a bad thing for some business leaders and those advocates to lobby the government to ensure that across the field we don't just have any regulation, but we have smart regulation to make sure that it doesn't matter how good of a company you are or how bad of a company you are, everybody has to play by the same rules, because ultimately the boom and bust cycle of social justice is not sustainable for saving the planet at the bottom line. We have to make sure everybody is held to the same standard and shareholders know that, because ultimately, where's that money gonna go that people are investing? It's to whatever company is most profitable. And if there's a way to undercut other people, even if it's unethical, so long as it's not illegal, they're going to do it. That's my hot take. Does that make sense? You know, I don't believe in this whole just making promises and not following through on it. I really believe that we need government. This is the role of the state, to help play. There's a reason why we have a government. It's to make sure everybody is raised to the same standard and held accountable, so that if you're producing materials in a totally environmentally destructive way, that there is a price to pay for that, either legally or through fines. And I think that it's great if we care. It's great if people talk about it, if companies talk about it, but really we need to make sure, even when we aren't talking about it, clean water still matters. Clean air still matters. Acting on climate change, even when it isn't in the media, or acting on racial justice, even when it isn't in the media, still matters. And the only way that you're ever gonna get that and get through that boom and bust cycle is by ensuring that the government itself is ensuring that everybody is held to that same standard.
I have a couple more questions here for you, David, but the audience questions are coming flying in, and I want to make sure we give people a chance. I have one here that says, yesterday you asked the CEO of Aflac about what the insurance industry can do to curb gun violence. What were you hoping his answer would be?
I don't know. That's part of the reason I asked it. If I had to, I think the answer that I hoped to hear from him was that, you know, as an insurance company, we understand that, you know, there are literal financial and human costs to gun violence, right? It does hurt the bottom line when there are more people with easy access to firearms for the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides in America, for example. It does hurt their bottom line when an insurance company has to pull out of Florida because the entire premise of their business model of insuring more people than they have to actually, you know, pay for claims for is invalid because of our government's own inaction on climate change, right? And I know that he said earlier that, you know, the company doesn't get political, and I understand that in some senses, but ultimately the company is going to be forced to become political when it affects your bottom line through something like climate change. And that's why I'm advocating that business leaders, advocates, and others come together so that we can all say in unison that we need smart, good regulation from the government to ensure that our planet is inhabitable for the next generation. Because ultimately, that's gonna really, you know what's gonna hurt shareholder value? Is if Florida is underwater. What's gonna hurt shareholder value is if we arm an entire society. Just think about this for a second. If we arm our entire society, we live in a society right now where we have guns that are being brought into Mexico from the United States that are arming the cartel, that then makes more money for those gun companies, because then the Mexican military needs to be armed against those heavily armed cartels. Then, when there's a ton of violence in Central and South America that the US government and our own gun companies are complicit in, and there's people fleeing that violence, the media and those gun companies grab onto racism and xenophobia to sell more guns, to say you need to be armed against these refugees that are coming across the border, which then sells more guns, which they then use the profits from to lobby the government more and fund more campaigns to weaken gun laws. Then you have instances like the mass shooting in El Paso, Texas, where the shooter said that there was a Hispanic invasion and that's why he was going to murder Mexican people, reiterating the same talking points as a lot of what was said on Fox News. Then you have more calls for action for stronger gun laws, then the gun companies use that to make more money to sell more guns. And as you sell more guns, what are you gonna get? Inevitably, more gun violence. Then you create a society where everybody is armed, so everybody else thinks that they need to be armed, where companies like Aflac and insurance companies in general are gonna seriously have their bottom lines hurt because all of a sudden, what normally would be a fist fight is now a shootout, right? How do you, in an instance where, let's say half the people in this room are armed like the NRA wants to create, or more, honestly, all of you, and there's a mass shooting that happens here. How do you tell who the good guy is and the bad guy is with the gun? How do the police tell who that is? And how do you ensure when you're a company to say that you aren't gonna get political, right? when our society is increasingly getting to a place where everybody is going to be armed, essentially, because we're outsourcing the very role of government to the individual to ensure the collective security of people, it's gonna hurt your bottom line, and you're gonna have to become political if you wanna have a company in that future. Because it's gonna cost a hell of a lot more than it does right now if everybody is armed and there's random, I mean, how many of you have kids that play like soccer? Raise your hand, right? How many of you have seen parents that are way too angry and take it way too seriously? Raise your hands, right? Imagine if those parents were armed and went off. Any instance like that is what the NRA is advocating for. They're not advocating for a world where people are taught to de-escalate situations. They're advocating for a world where everybody feels the need to be armed because everybody else is armed, to be protected from the very people that we're selling the guns to in order to sell more guns. That's gonna hurt your bottom line, and you're gonna have to become political, because if you don't, ultimately it's gonna seriously hurt your shareholders, and I guarantee you, you're gonna start talking about it. That's my take.
We've got another one here that says, knowing your focus on the next gen, what communications channels are you seeing as the most effective in rallying your audience and bringing them together? I know you've historically been quite active on Twitter, or I guess X now as it's called, but we've seen, you know, it's been a tumultuous state for the platform over the past few months, and especially the past few days with what's going on, a flood of disinformation amidst what's going on between Israel and Gaza. I'm just curious, I guess, on the broader state of play for social media, which communications channels do you see as effective and usable right now?
I mean, that's complicated because, you know, I have a platform with 1 million+ followers on X or Twitter or whatever the hell you want to call it. It's probably going to be Y tomorrow. And I'm, you know, I've seen how the attacks and harassment has gotten far worse. I've seen, you know, I think when you fire like half your company, and part of that is content moderation, you're gonna see, I've started seeing a lot more dead bodies on Twitter, for example, from the recent conflict. And it's just in your feed a lot of the time. And I think the most effective channels that I've thought about using are really Instagram Reels. And I know there's a lot of younger people who use TikTok too, but honestly, I think like, I just haven't been on TikTok very much. And that's in part because it's just, I have conflicted feelings about some of the privacy issues that come with that. But I think Instagram Reels are helpful, but it's hard to answer that question because I think we're in a pretty big shift right now. You know, I think in evolutionary biology, sorry to take you back to that, but there's a concept called punctuated equilibrium that basically holds that essentially species don't really change very much for a very long time, and then all of a sudden there's enough environmental changes that add up that everything changes extremely quickly. And this is also a theory in social theory about how revolutions happen. And I think we're in one of those moments right now with social media and content moderation, with AI and all these other things adding on to it, where I don't really know where it's gonna end up, because I don't think it's just Instagram. I don't think it's just Twitter. I don't think it's just TikTok. I think it's really evolving right now so fast that I can't really tell you what the best place to put it on is, because there's Threads, there's TikTok, there's Snapchat, and the answer is basically trying to do all of them at the same time, which is exhausting because it's like 12 different apps, but you got to play like the best odds that you can.
Yeah, and I think this kind of relates to it too. We've got another question from the audience that says here, how do you think young people can use communications, and how can comms be broadly used to help fight against gun violence and other important issues?
I think talking about it in the first place. Honestly, the NRA are masters of communication. And just as an example of that, you know, there were a lot of conspiracy theories spread about me after the shooting at my high school, because we were so eloquent and knew what we were talking about afterwards because of my experience in TV production and speech and debate, that people literally thought it was more likely that we worked for the FBI than our education system could actually be effective, which is sad, but it's the truth. And the reality is the NRA are masterful storytellers. Even though self-defense gun use is exceptionally rare in the United States, anytime there's one instance of self-defense gun use, it's on Breitbart, it's on Fox News, it's on every media site that they can get. Because you and I can argue about statistics. This is what the NRA and the right wing understands a lot more than liberals do. Statistics do not change people's minds. Stories do. You all understand this, I'm sure. I can argue all I want all day with other people about statistics about gun violence. I can't argue that that one instance of self-defense gun use that was successful didn't happen. But what does the NRA do when there is a shooting at a high school where you say your number one media strategy is to say you can't talk about this, you're politicizing this? What do you do when those very students who went through the shooting are speaking out and demanding action? You have to literally convince people that those students don't exist or that they work for the FBI or some shadowy, fucked up government conspiracy. So that smear campaign becomes the story and drowns out those students' voices. And that is what the power of social media has been for us, is that it enables us to have our own voices and not have it entirely dictated by the NRA. And in the time since Parkland, just to give you some, because I know we're closing out soon, just to give you some perspective, people said that we couldn't change gun laws after what happened in Parkland because we're just a bunch of kids. And this is Florida. The NRA controls this state. And we said, okay, watch us. And I think one of the greatest assets young people have is that we're really stupid sometimes, frankly. And I mean that in a good way. Like, we're naive. We don't accept the status quo because we don't know the status quo. So the only thing that we accepted was that we should have a government that actually works for us and protects us. So despite what everybody said, despite what all those older people said, we still showed up, and we raised the age to buy guns in Florida to 21, and we passed a red flag law that enables you to disarm people that are at risk to themselves or others, like the shooter at my high school. And that very law was used to disarm somebody that sent a death threat to my own mother, an NRA supporter, that said, F with the NRA and you'll be DOA. We used the law that we passed after Parkland. Because the law that we passed, it may have prevented me from having to bury my own mother. So not only have we done that, we've had the highest voting rates in American history. In 2018, we voted out more NRA-backed politicians than ever before in American history. We had millions of students march with us and walk out with us and register to vote across the country. And in the time since, we've passed over 100 gun laws at the state level. We've also passed the first federal gun law in 30 years and elected a president who is not afraid to say, F the NRA, who is not afraid to say ban assault weapons and that we need to boldly lead on gun violence, right? Even though it has taken a long time and gun violence is still happening, we have had monumental changes, and it's because of one thing in particular: our communication and us speaking to our generation about the unacceptable nature of gun violence in this country. And the thing that I need most from you all to help with that is your help. We need to tell more stories. We've done really powerful PSAs with ad firms like McCann Erickson and others where we took body bags and put them on the National Mall and spelled out thoughts and prayers. We've also done PSAs with them and other agencies that have been incredibly impactful, one of which, as one final example, where we took a group of people at their workplace and said that they're gonna do a active shooter drill. And they're all sitting there and there's hidden cameras everywhere. I wish I could show you guys this PSA because it's really powerful. And then they say, okay, we're gonna have an expert come in and talk about this. And an 8-year-old walks in. That is what we need more of. I need your help telling those stories more. So if any of you want to help March for Our Lives produce more of those PSAs, do more of that storytelling to counter the propaganda from the gun industry and the NRA, we need your help because we don't have a massive budget like a lot of the other groups, but we do have a lot of cultural capital with our generation, and we need your help to spend it. So thank you.
I think we are unfortunately out of time here. I see the clock is counting upwards. I'm not sure what's going on there. But ladies and gentlemen, let's give it one more round of applause for David Hogg. That was fantastic.